Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Okay, let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. And I think what promises to be a very interesting and insightful discussion on the role of commercial satellite remote sensing systems and how they can help meet national security ISR demands, and how government acts as both a customer and a regulator of this industry. Before we get started, I want to let people know that we will be taking questions from the audience later in the discussion. So if you want to ask a question, just click on the Q&A button that you see here at the bottom of your Zoom window. That'll pop up another window where you can see questions other people have already asked. You can upvote them if you want to see that same question asked. If you don't see your question, then you can type it in and submit it. And so, please feel free to go ahead and start writing questions in there at any time during the discussion as we get going. I also want to thank our sponsors for today's event. HawkEye 360, Planet, and Umbra graciously sponsored this event. I also want to thank our three panelists who are joining us today for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us for this. I'm going to go around and introduce them each, just give some brief introductions, and then we're going to jump right into the discussion today. So first of all, I'm pleased to welcome Sue Gordon. She served not too long ago as Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. She also previously served as Deputy Director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the NGA, and that's on top of roughly 3 decades of government service in the intelligence community. So Sue, thank you so much for joining us. Next is Kevin O'Connell. Kevin is the former director of the Office of Space Commerce at the Department of Commerce. He has extensive experience in government. Looking over his bio, he's been at DOD, Department of State, served on the National Security Council, the Office of the Vice President, and the Office of the Director of Central Intelligence. And notably, he previously worked in a think tank. He was a research analyst at RAND and their first director of RAND's Intelligence Policy Center. So Kevin, thank you for joining us. Last, we have joining us on our panel, Derek Tournier. He is currently the director of the Space Development Agency that is part of the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Derek has also had numerous positions both in government and in private industry, including stints at IARPA, DARPA, Los Alamos National Lab, and at Harris Corporation, to name a few. So thank you, Derek, for joining us. All right, so I'll kick off the discussion here. Sue, I want to go to you first with the kind of a question and opening remarks that you might want to make. But what I'd like to hear from you is, based on your time in government and particularly at NGA, what do you see as the value of commercial satellite remote sensing systems to the intelligence community?
Well, one, thanks for having me. I can't believe I'm so lucky to be on a panel with Derek and Kevin. That's a great day for me. So I think the first thing is, let's just embrace the fact that we're going there and how capable these systems are, and the technology is just exploding in terms of its uses and the reliability and the opportunities of the systems. And I think on the one hand, that is a really great reflection of what government is supposed to do, which is the taxpayer invests dollars in the government. It comes up with solutions for national security, and those technologies make their way into society for collective good. And I think that's what's happening here. So one, I'm just really excited about it. Two, from a government national security perspective, the advent of commercial remote sensing capabilities in all the spectral regions, I think opens up really exciting opportunities for the government. One is to just have more coverage to have more opportunity. Two, to I'm going to choose the word, to offload some of the requirements that have driven government systems, because they were the only actors. So you kind of had to make the systems that you have do everything from exquisite to more common. In the imaging world, it's from the really high resolution to the broad area coverage. Now you have the opportunity to say, well, how can we get that requirement met? The third advantage I think is really interesting is just the advent of X as a service. And I'm going to say remote sensing as a service, where you actually have the opportunity to not just get more images broadly, but you might also get more answers that you can get directly from commercial companies. So I think there's just a really interesting opportunity. Don't misunderstand. There are some things that only the government are going to need, only the government are going to have to drive, and there will always be that engine for those unique requirements that require remarkable investment and then capability. But when I look at it, I say the combination of the two is going to give the United States great advantage and give us more choices in both what we acquire and how we operate.
All right, thank you very much. And Kevin, I want to follow up with you and get your thoughts on, from the policy perspective. NSPD 27, of course, is our national policy that governs commercial satellite remote sensing. I think it's been almost 2 decades since that was last updated. How do you think our national policy in this area needs to evolve, given all of the changes that we've been seeing in the private sector over the past 2 decades?
Yeah, thanks, Todd, and delighted to be here with you today. Really appreciate the invitation. There's remarkable continuity in American space policy going back, many, many decades, and this is no exception. Sometimes I mark this remote sensing world as going back to PDD 23. If you're old enough to remember that, 1994, we'll celebrate the anniversary of that, early next year. And again, there's been remarkable continuity here. American policy has been unambiguously that U.S. industry should lead globally on this topic. So whether it be one instrument or another, obviously we published National Space Policy in 2020 that did a couple of things. It reaffirmed that specific point, but it also elevated the role of commercial broadly in national space policy. And of course, we redid the commercial remote sensing regulations at a slightly lower level. We redid those in 2020, released them, I believe, in May 2020. And so I think at the policy level, we're golden. There's a real important direction we want to head here. I think the harder challenges are in the implementation of those regulations, the imagery issues specifically, and we can talk about how this relates to other areas of commercial space activities, what we see in the space economy more broadly. This is a case where we sometimes play offense and we sometimes play defense because of that competition between economic activities, commercial activities, and at least a perceived national security concern. And we should probably dig in a little bit more on that if we can. The extent to which we're implementing in a more haphazard way is not reflective of a world-class industry. And what we really need to do is unleash industry. This is a game of offense, not defense.
Well, let's pull that thread a bit. So, do you think that the way that we're implementing our, regulations and licenses, are we holding back our commercial space remote sensing industry?
Yeah, I think we continue to rethink, different aspects of this, and I think we see it. You may recall that in the rulemaking activity that led up to the release of the policy or the regulation in 2020, we introduced the concept of availability. Okay, and the availability test was meant to fuel American innovation, to take away regulatory review for things that were commonly available. And in fact, I think instead of it doing that, it's sometimes applied as a brake. If someone else doesn't have precisely the capability in the market that we have, then we heavily condition U.S. companies. Okay, that's almost like saying if you're in a race car in a race, you sit in the passenger seat until somebody else drives by you, and then you hop over, start your engines, and hope you can catch up. That is not the approach one needs to take. Not saying there are not serious security concerns we have to think about, but security in this area, and we've seen it achieved in other areas like with GPS, security in this area is also achieved by economic growth, shaping the global market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk more about that a little later.
All right, I look forward to digging into there more. Derek, I want to bring you into the conversation here. So at the Space Development Agency, you're working with a broad range of both, traditional space companies and newer non-traditional space companies. From your experiences, what can the U.S. government be doing to better leverage commercial space systems to deliver capabilities to the warfighter faster?
Yes, excellent, Todd. So that I would say, we're of the mindset that we want to unleash the commercial industry, much like what Kevin was saying. The book Freedom's Forge talks about how that was done in World War II to really get the leverage up. And so how do we do that? And what's the SDA doing to look forward to that? I would say that the whole idea is to capitalize on the commoditization of the commercial space industry. So our goal is to buy satellites and own and operate those from the government, not to have those be procured as a service. Much like Sue said, that's because there are parts of government missions that you certainly want the government to have control over. But as far as everything else, we want to encourage the commercial industry to keep developing for satellite communications, and we encourage the department to buy that where it's needed. So for the SDA in particular, what we do is we want to set and get industry comfortable that we will create a market and we will buy hundreds of satellites every other year, that so they feel empowered to invest in their commercial enterprise so that they can commoditize those components and leverage what they have in an existing line. In addition, it'd even be great if they got into the model of keeping enough stock on hand to where when we bought from them, it wasn't starting from scratch and you had all these long lead items, and they were able to just pull off of the same parts that they were using to develop and build their commercial satellites for either themselves or other commercial companies and pull that in. So that's what SDA is looking at. And I think that's the best aspect to be able to push this, is just set a very stable, very predictable market that industry can feel empowered to invest towards and know that they can go after and win a portion of that market share.
Wow, so you want to be a regular and reliable customer. I think a lot of companies would like that. Sue, I want to come back to you. So, thinking about ownership of some of the commercial systems, where, NGA, NRO, others are acquiring data products from them. How important is it that those companies be U.S. owned and operated? And I'll put it another way. What concerns would you have about buying these services from foreign companies?
So I'm always concerned about acquiring services from foreign companies and relying on that in a straight national security arena. So it's always a concern, and we have a lot of mechanisms to protect us from that. But not all foreign countries are the same in terms of the legal framework of that company. China's a great example where just their legal framework says that their companies must respond and work with their intelligence services, and that just definitionally would be very problematic. But they're not the only ones. So I think you have to look at the services being provided and look at the country that is providing it. I always worry about supply chain. I think the government is making real headway in terms of driving that supply chain to be known and to be diversified, because risks come from both ways. The other thing is, as more and more capabilities incorporate artificial intelligence, or as I hope that happens, so that we can get ever faster and ever smaller bandwidths to have the products. I worry a lot about the algorithmic assurance that goes with that. And then if you're going to be buying a service, how can you assure that the product has not been faked in some way? So all of those we're going to have to sort out along the way in order to be able to use it. I don't know that it precludes it by any stretch, because there are protections that we have put in to place as a government, everything from what the CFIUS FIRMA process does to ensure that you set up proxy companies to be able to provide that level of installation. So I just would encourage people not to think of it as a hard and fast barrier, but a thoughtful consumer of foreign services. And then just I guess the last tangential point I'd make is, Derek and I were both talking about the provision of services. There is an intermediate step if you want to provide service. And if you think back to what the CIA did with Amazon Web Services back in the day when it wanted to take advantage of commercial cloud, and what it did was it put its own instantiation of a cloud. You can imagine the same sort of thing happening with some commercial remote sensing services. If you needed to go that way, you could create a way to have that kind of barrier while still taking advantage of the symbiosis with the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, it requires some different ideas and approaches to how you contract, right?
Well, don't you think that's what this moment is about? And I think that's what Kevin was saying, and I think that was Derek, is the imperatives of national security and the government are kind of persistent, but the modality in which you can achieve those imperative changes with the different opportunity. And I think this really is a moment to not just throw caution to the wind at the needs of the government, but how you might achieve that and how you balance straight risk with opportunity costs and make sure that you're not, in protecting so hard, you're not precluding use that might provide real advantage. So I think that's what this moment is how do we find new ways to think about this?
Well, yeah, and Kevin, back to you on this, in terms of, how do you think about that balance, right, between protecting national security interests, but also maintaining kind of our advantage, in the marketplace and maintaining a robust commercial servicing, industry here. We're seeing lots of new types of commercial remote sensing capabilities. It's not just electro-optical, it's synthetic aperture radar, it's RF mapping, it's non-Earth imaging, which, let's call it what it is, satellite to satellite imagery. How do you think about, from a government perspective, having come out of commerce, how do we balance those, national security needs with not wanting to hold our industry back and always be second place in the commercial market?
Yeah, so number one, I'm as excited as you are about the different things coming in the market. I think the government, and I spoke a lot about this at Commerce, if you draw a trend line, the government really has become a much better buyer. And what that means is the government, through various mechanisms, may it be pitch days or other things like this, can plant a number of seeds, can invest not tiny amounts of money, but substantial amounts of money in different experiments in areas that the government wants to leverage. It's not a social welfare program. It's legitimately in areas that are tangential, if you will, to the existing program. So on the one hand, invest in these capabilities, be a first adopter of some of these things, even in an experimental way. And again, I think there's some success stories there. Secondly, you have to spend some money on these things. And so I think one of the things we hear is that in the commercial remote sensing world, the budget line has been fairly constant. The mix has been different over the years. Make a substantial investment in these things because of what you're able to leverage. Derek hit on this, which is that sometimes in the government, what we say is, I want to leverage commercial, but I want it to only do what I, the government, want it to do. That's not a commercial interaction, and you have to be comfortable both with getting what the commercial capability provides. You can help drive that, but you also have to recognize that other people who you may know or like or not like are going to also use that capability. And so the other part of this is on the regulatory side, the policy side. We need to make sure that all of our regulations are kept up to date in what is a blisteringly fast market. Again, I've talked about the regulations from 2 years ago. In many ways, we have to look. I think we had put in the regulation that we were going to relook the NEI issue because we expected the market to be different. And in fact, it is different. And I'll revert later on to your point about satellite to satellite things, because I think with the space debris issue, we need to rethink that as well.
Yeah. Well, and Derek, a question to you. So, what you're doing with the SDA, you're building out a sensing layer in LEO, and you're leveraging commercial capabilities and commercial companies. But, thinking more broadly, how do you think commercial and government systems can work together to deliver things like tactical ISR? Is that something you're trying to bridge?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As an example, we have a contract with Capella Space, commercial SAR provider, right? And we're working with them so that they can put one of our compliant optical intersatellite links directly on their satellite, so that then they could plug in directly to our transport layer. We would love to do that with all commercial ISR providers, right? And enable that. Obviously, there's a lot of security constraints there, and figure out the right way to make that handshake and make that work. But that I think benefits both us, because it benefits the department, because it allows us to take those tactical data from whomever has the sensing solution, fuse it with other data that could be coming from government systems, or it could be coming from other commercial systems, fuse those on board, and use that to actually send down in theater over our protected tactical data links directly to the warfighter. And it also benefits commercial, because it gives them a completely new path to market, right? It gives them, now they can have an offering that goes directly into the transport layer, directly to the user. That's just another offering that they can use to sell their data. And obviously, then you would pay that commercial company either buy the data stream or have some other kind of subscription service.
Yeah, great points. I want to look at the questions here from the audience, and there's one in particular, and I want to ask, if each of you want to take a second to respond to this. But the question, paraphrasing here, is, as our adversaries recognize the commercial space systems that the U.S. government's able to leverage, they're of course going to try to deny, degrade, and defeat those commercial capabilities. So if that happens, what kind of actions and policies do you think the U.S. government should have in place to protect commercial space systems? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first, and then you guys can fix it. I guess to my way, I think there's an analog between cyber policy and space policy. The things that we're working on and the things that not yet achieved. So here's my view: if a nation state takes an action against a commercial satellite, that's a nation state making a sovereign attack against it, that it happens to be commercial, and we have to have a policy that accounts for that. And to me, that is almost independent of for whom that satellite is providing service. So I think US space policy, just like US cyber policy, has really got to get a hold on how do we see that and how do we have some deterrent effect. And then I think the second is knowing that that is likely to be the case, that the minute you introduce commercial capabilities into your national security architecture, they become much more interesting. And I think that's the question that the national security community, and Derek probably wrestles with every day, is how do I both rely on it and not control it in the same way that I do others? And so I think there's a kind of a government approach to how do we deal with that reliance without control, at the same time that you need a policy that says nation state against a US capability is a hostile act, and we have to have a deterrent capability against that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Derek. Go ahead.
Okay, so I would completely agree. I would use a couple different data points that I think everyone needs to be aware of, and then we can talk from there, right? So a lot of our adversaries, they don't delineate within their own systems on what is commercial and what is national, because they don't have a clear delineation between civil and defense space like the United States does. And so since they don't, a lot of times they don't really recognize that the United States does. And of course, you have civil, commercial, and DoD space, and those are clear delineations in the U.S. that a lot of our adversaries don't recognize. So we have to understand that they're going to treat a lot of these systems as part of the U.S. National defense infrastructure, and are willing to attack that. And I think we just need to be aware of that. And I would use the analogy. I think I hadn't really thought about the analogy with cyber before. I think that's a great one. I always think of the analogy of, one of the main missions of the United States Navy is to maintain open sea lanes of communication, right? Freedom of access and operation on the ocean. And that's one of the missions that the Space Force has taken on, to make sure that there is this ability for people to operate in space in a way that they can make, that the U.S. Space Force can make sure that we can continue to do the department's mission to push these things forward. And it's the same, that's just an extension of what the Navy does in the sea. So I agree, there needs to be policies. Obviously, if there are actions taken against commercial infrastructure that's supporting the department, that has to be responded accordingly.
So I just throw in a couple of points. Number one, start with companies' interest in knowing that it has to self-protect in many ways. Again, they're not going to avoid cybersecurity, knowing what the environment's like out there, but also have a robust conversation with the U.S. government for those times when they're hit by something they don't understand, or just very, very difficult. And so you could see in the development of Space Policy Directive 5, space cyber activities, and the Space ISR Act that went along with it, there's a basis for that kind of a conversation. Secondly, we need to continue to have policies which encourage commercial industry to do things, but not in a heavy-handed way, using commercial state-of-the-art practices, et cetera. And then lastly, with recognition of the point that Derek made about how other countries characterize their space systems, the risk, the calculus for an adversary when they attack a commercial system will also have to include the fact that they might annoy a lot of other people who are not directly linked to U.S. interests. Now, they may not care about that, but it is a different calculation than if you're actually going after something wholly involved with U.S. national security.
Well, I want to ask the flip side of this question now. And do you all have concerns about the commercial remote sensing capabilities that are being offered, that are, can be publicly acquired, that those capabilities being used in ways that could harm the U.S. government or U.S. government interest? Is that a concern for you folks?
Yes. Right. I always, this is a world where increasingly every technology is available to everyone, and it's about clever use. So I worry about adversaries and competitors with intention now recognizing that there's another path by which they can achieve that intention. And so I think, I can't remember whether it was Derek or Kevin who said, first things first is the provider themselves have got to deliver their capability to a certain standard of assurance. Whether the government can help them articulate that standard, but I think those things are known. And then from the user perspective, I think there is always a mind toward what is the chance that what you're seeing is not real. There's craft around that. It will have to be applied here. And then I think the last thing is just recognize that we are at the beginning of imagining how this can all be used. And so just from a security perspective, not just a space security, thinking about what that means in terms of US operations and US intention that used to be protected just by a geography is not going to be protected in the same way. So you're going to see a whole new craft of security and protection coming just because the skies are increasingly able to image the skin of the earth every day, all the time.
And I mean, I don't know if Kevin or Derek, if you want to weigh in on this, but it just seems like it is inevitable that the Earth is becoming more transparent. What we do, what others people do, it's becoming much more transparent, and there's not a lot that we can do to stop that. We just have to be prepared for it. Would you, agree, disagree?
Yeah. So the answer to your question, Todd, obviously is, of course, we're all concerned about that. Remember that I co-authored a book in 1999 called Commercial Observation Satellites at the Leading Edge of Global Transparency. And if you can get through that title and not fall asleep, what you realize is that's the nature of the beast here. It's an issue where we have to continue to adapt in everything we've done. And there's some adaptation that's been underway and some that's not been underway, obviously. And I think that adaptation involves a couple of things. One, early adoption by the government, understand what the capability is, as opposed to say, gee, that would never work, or I'm fearful that capability would be out there, be a first adopter. Secondly, taking a very, very objective view of where that capability is or a substitute for it in other things that are available to an adversary. Sometimes we look only through the lens at this particular set of capabilities and we forget that people can fly aircraft and they can do a whole host of other things. It's not an objective view. And if you make the wrong calculation here, you actually create a situation whereby limiting US capabilities, you create a situation that's actually more dangerous than if you had done nothing at all.
And Derek, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I completely agree that we're getting in that, and I think that Kevin hit it very well. That you certainly don't want to limit U.S. commercial companies, because that has happened in the past, and all that will essentially do is allow the foreign competitors to grow up and then overtake what the U.S. commercial industry can do, and you certainly don't want that. I would say that sure, the world is getting more transparent with commercial remote sensing. It's very difficult to hide, but I would contend that if you look at the cost-benefit trade, the U.S. as a free and open society has a lot less to lose than a lot of these closed societies when the world gets more transparent.
Totally agree, Derek.
Especially if you consider the economic benefits and achieving security through the economic aspects.
And then I think we've each made this point, but I feel the need to hammer home. By embracing it rather than holding it at arm's length, by thinking about its uses and its potential misuses, you will get innovation just because of that, right? Innovation in so many domains. So I think we have so many examples where we have held things off because we were afraid, and the impact is we didn't grow as fast as we might have.
Well, and there's a great example Kevin can probably talk about, where we strangled the space radar commercial industry, and we didn't stop it from getting developed. It just went elsewhere.
It's the example to avoid.
Yeah. No, I see one question from the audience here. The question is the answer for the U.S. government to be buying more commercial imagery? Aren't these companies already too dependent on the U.S. government as a buyer? What do you guys think?
Why don't I start there? Because what's different today than, say, 20 years ago is that if the government becomes a first buyer, then there's another player that we haven't talked about yet, and it's the private capital markets. And the magic that has happened in recent years has been where someone has come in, gotten, if you're old enough to remember this metaphor, the underwriter's lab seal of approval from the US government by virtue of a small contract. And then they're able to go out into the capital markets. And the capital markets can say everything from, gee, congratulations, you're going to be a government contractor for the next 20 years, and maybe that's a great business, to, gee, we really see the potential for commercialization, and here's $10 to $100 million to go do what you need to do. And I think that's an important dynamic. That's a new part of this story. It also represents a different reflection on risk than the way the government would look at it.
Sue, Derek?
I think Kevin hit the broad strokes of it. I do think there is the government has made real growth in the areas of being able to actually partner with the private sector without having to own the intellectual property or control it, in part because we saw the downside of that, but in part because increasingly people didn't want to offer that to us. So to me, everything Kevin said was true. And I think there's just a new era of being able to use without needing to own. I also think that what's happening in the commercial market is when you think not just about the provision of images, but the provision of services, to go back to that, when it services, the viability of those commercial systems to other commercial ventures and other ventures outside the government goes sky high. And so I think you worry about it, but I think there's a lot of good to the partnership. And I think this is an area that we're actually learning to partner, not necessarily need to be a wholly owned owner of the systems, which just we know isn't the way that you do it in 2021. I think the government knows that this isn't the way this works.
Well, you know, Derek, there's a related question here from the audience. It's specific to the SDA. And the question is there a role for government-owned but commercially operated systems and the future architecture that you're envisioning?
So for our actually, that's how we're planning on operating our Tranche 1 satellites. So the Tranche 1 satellites, transport satellites, will have 144 of our comm satellites up there for tactical data comm. But those will be owned by the U.S. government and essentially operated by the U.S. government. But if you look at our operation center, so we'll have an operation center at Grand Forks and another operation center at Redstone. Those operation centers will be on government property at government facilities, but we actually are soliciting for a contractor to run that, to be able to operate the satellites and be able to keep that network open. So in that sense, we are envisioning looking at those satellites under a government-owned contractor-operated model to see how that works. And that's our plan for Tranche 1.
Oh, that's good to know. And yeah, I mean, that's, very different than the way that we normally do business between the government and the private sector. Another question, just for whoever wants to jump in here, in recent years, we've seen a lot of private capital going into the commercial space sector in the US and around the world. It's not just been unique to the United States, although, our companies have certainly benefited quite a bit from it. Are any of you concerned about, the U.S., losing its, leadership role and technological advantage when it comes to commercial space?
Yeah, I think this is critical as to why we need to keep regulations as dynamic as they possibly can. Again, we're only a little less than 2 years since the last review. And they're hard to do, by the way. They consume a lot of time, et cetera. I don't mean to diminish that, having been part of the last round. But if we're not careful, we have seen cases, and we'll see more cases, especially because of the liquidity in the global markets, where businesses will seek the most permissive business environment where they can be. And we used to think about this as a theoretical concern. It's no longer a theoretical concern. It's actually a concern that I worry about quite a bit. I worried about it when I was at Commerce. We did some work on flag of choice options and things like that. And so it's a very real concern. So we have to keep our regulations as modern as possible, as up to date as possible, to allow for the innovation that this industry can provide, or it can go elsewhere.
Sue, you have thoughts?
Always. And they're aligned with Kevin. And Derek said this earlier, remember, the advantages of a free and open society are remarkable. Our country's strength is in part the result of just the opportunity for people to go as far as they can, compete as hard as they can, come up with ideas that they can. And then as those mature, there are opportunities. We really, really, as attractive as it may seem to shut out other competitors or focus our activities, you have to be mindful that that is antithetical to the strength of the nation. So got to be smart about how we use it, got to be thoughtful to ensure that our security is maintained. But I think we, in general, are far better served by free and open competition, and then the purpose and our uses driving that, than the alternative, which is to say, narrow it down, only do what the government can think of and be afraid of the things that happen outside that control. I think we need to remember what our strength is, and that strength wins over time, always.
Derek, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Sue said. I think that's the whole idea, is we want to encourage the competition as much as possible. I've often said, I want to do that inside the department. I encourage competition because that's the way to get the strongest space architecture, and it's the way you're going to get the strongest space industry. I haven't seen a lot of areas where I think that the U.S. space industry their leadership is being threatened by foreign competition. I just don't see that. I do see it in certain components where there are foreign companies that are actually kind of leading the market. Optical crosslinks are one, but there's a lot of advances there. But if you look at how quickly U.S. industry can respond and come up with products, it's pretty amazing. Because if you look at commercial SAR, it wasn't that long ago where that was dominated by Europe, and now there's a couple different U.S. commercial SAR companies that are now just as strong as the European ones. So I think that as long as we don't try to stifle the competition, it will thrive, and the U.S. industry will continue to lead in space.
So I want to take a minute and ask you all to address the elephant in the room. Just yesterday, the news broke that Russia apparently conducted a destructive anti-satellite test in orbit, in a fairly high orbit, in over 400 kilometers up in Leo, producing at least 1,500 pieces of debris that have been tracked so far. I just want to throw it out there, see what your guys' thoughts are, and in particular, how do actions like this, irresponsible actions by other countries, how is that going to affect the long-term sustainability of the space domain for commercial and national security missions? I don't know, Sue, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm going to be short. I'm going to turn it over to the other two as well. So let's be clear, there is no one that understands space and the space environment as well as Russia does. So let's not be confused about whether they didn't understand the likely impact of their action. It's not that they didn't understand orbital dynamics. They didn't understand what was happening in that band. And these are very experienced space actors. And so that is a concern to me, because that kind of brazen activity is just worrisome, especially related to the issue we had before about where's the U.S. space policy going when it comes to activities that are counter ours and free and open use. So that's one. And then the second, I'll leave it to Kevin and Derek to talk about. Responsible use of space is really, really important. It's really important for all these companies to be participants in, not just regulated over, but for them to be participants and understanding that they won't have an environment to use if they aren't responsible players themselves. But I'll let that conversation turn it over to my friend Kevin and then Derek to talk about how we might respond to this sort of activity and what the impact is.
So how could I help it be more excited about a conversation that has both of my favorite space topics in it, commercial remote sensing and space sustainability? Incredibly irresponsible move by the Russians, obviously. And it just reaffirms that we have to stay on track to continue American leadership practices for decades at this point, and continue to leverage the private sector very, very heavily in this. Again, to bring the two themes together, we're about to see the emergence of space-based debris sensing capabilities that will complement the ones that are on the ground. And we're going to need all of the eyes and ears that we can in space to monitor the space debris problem, to help people stay safe in space, and then enable the Department of Defense to do the things that it wants to do in space and needs to do in space with the Space Domain Awareness Mission, as Derek fully knows. So, it's terribly disappointing to see that development yesterday. In all of this, we want to take advantage of the bigger set of trends in the space economy. And this is the one thing that can really, really do damage to the many different things that are going on in terms of space exploration and the growth of space commerce.
Derek, you have some thoughts?
Sure. So I won't comment on this particular action, but I will comment in general about the space activities. So obviously, the U.S. and all other nations should act responsibly in space to try to maintain that open lanes of communication for all spacefaring nations. And I would contend that if you look at that is one of the main reasons that SDA has chosen to put its constellation up in the 1,000 to 1,200 kilometer orbit. Space gets incredibly congested when you get 600 kilometers and below. That's typically where a lot of people do their missions, because you naturally decay within 25 years, and so that meets the orbital debris space mitigation policies that most people have kind of taken as an international norm to work under. So clearly, anything that increases congestion anywhere in space is something that should be condemned and not practiced. That's part of everything that we do. In SDA is following that debris mitigation policy to try to mitigate that. We try to operate in regimes where our satellites won't be as susceptible to debris from other activities, but it is clearly not something that should be encouraged. But I will say, since we're talking a lot about commercial industry, that is now a business opportunity that I didn't appreciate as much a couple of years ago. I was always of the mindset that I didn't think there would ever be a true business case to doing orbital maintenance or debris removal. But I'm starting to think now the way satellites are being built and operated and launched in different orbits and then being maneuvered to operational orbits, starting to think that that's an opportunity for commercial industry to come up with ways to remove defunct satellites or to move operational satellites prior to the start of their mission, to have this space tug service that can also act as a debris mitigation. Not obviously, once you have an effect where you have hundreds of pieces or thousands of pieces of debris, the return on investment for removing those pieces gets extremely small. But to go after large, massive pieces and to remove those, that's something that I'm hoping that commercial industry takes on and starts to develop offerings for.
Yeah, I think it's not just an opportunity; it's a necessity, because the space environment, minus the developments of the last weekend, the space environment is already changing so rapidly that the only chance we have to keep up with it is to use the innovation and the speed of the private sector. Doesn't mean that government is going to play a critically important role, but industry will adapt in many different ways, whether it be different service offerings, improving our ability to not create new debris before they head into space, all the way out through SSA, traffic management and coordination, and then even active debris removal, as we're seeing happen now.
Well, a follow-up question here, and Derek, since you're in government, I'm not going to ask you to address this. No need to try to write policy live on Zoom, but to Sue and Kevin, I'm going to combine a couple of questions from the audience here. Is it time that the U.S. rewrite our debris mitigation guidelines to be more stringent? And is it time that the U.S. government come out and publicly support a ban on destructive ASAT testing?
Whoa. Okay. So think of the answer, Kevin, Mr. Policy. But two things to keep in mind. When you write policies, you're trying to achieve particular effects. One is bans on testing have a long history in America through our nuclear programs, and there are good things from a counterproliferation side, and there are bad things in terms of it stops some people advancing and other people's from not. So I think on the destructive ASAT would be something you'd really have to look at in terms of how you would write a policy to make sure you didn't have unintended consequence of disadvantaging us. And then the other is it time to have policies that buttress the responsible use of space? And you can do a climate example. And what I would say is, again, you have to think of it in terms of what effect you're achieving and how the policy actually works to achieve that effect within the context of what we can do, not just one that is absolutely driven to some level that actually can't be achieved and won't allow the advance we need. Now, Kevin.
Yeah, so to follow right on the heels of that, whatever policy you want to put in place, it needs to be data driven, data supported, et cetera. There are many times people would come to us at Commerce and say, hey, why don't you put a regulation in place that says this? And the analytic basis for that was what I would call wishful thinking. Okay, nothing can destroy an industry faster than that kind of policy. And so when you look around for rigorously collected data to support a number of decisions, that's where we have to head. And I will note, Bob Vilal will now run this unit over at NASA, in which she's talking about data-driven decisions, and that's very positive. Would agree with Sue on the weapons and space ban. Look at the intended and unintended consequences of such a move. I think there's pretty strong resolve in the international community that things like happened this weekend, courtesy of the Russians, should stop happening. Okay, and how you implement that's a discussion for the diplomats.
Well, and I'll open this one back up and get Derek in the conversation here, shifting gears. Are there particular types of space-based remote sensing capabilities that you all think are really hopeful and would be really helpful to the U.S. government to see commercial companies try to advance, or specific, phenomenologies, types of sensors where you'd like to see more advancement in the commercial sector? Derek, I'll start with you.
So I'd like to see more advancements in all-weather ISR. So that's the commercial SAR, but also one that we really hadn't discussed a lot. But that's commercial weather. So that's an area that is civil, and DoD has needs in that. But I think that there's a lot of commercial markets for that now. If you look at the number 2 downloaded apps on phones for is longest running time, right after social media, has been weather. Obviously, there's a market for that, and I think that commercial weather satellites, I would love to see industry take that on and be able to provide that as a service, not only for the department, but for civil at large.
Boy, has DoD had a history of weather satellite programs that have started and stopped and started and stopped.
Right.
Sue, Kevin, other types of remote sensing capabilities you think you'd like to see more advancement in the commercial sector?
So I'm a fan of hyperspectral, so I think there are some really interesting things that could be done in terms of detection of human activity, everything from climate to population movement, that I think hyperspectral could help you in some ways. But what my wishful thinking is, and this is, I'm analogy girl today. Like in AI, we have narrow AI. I think what I would love to see happening is, again, multi-domain, cross-domain, cross-spectral capabilities that actually work in concert with one another at the orbital level to come up with some really new sensing of what's going on by doing different spectral bands in combination with each other. I think that would be a really interesting way to go.
So I'm also a fan of hyperspectral. I think we have the ability now to move from characterization to diagnosis and even prediction. And let me come at it from the other direction, which is we're seeing so much of a need for these capabilities as we try to understand developments on Earth better, whether they be human-centered or natural developments, everything from wildfire prediction to water quality, et cetera. So there's going to be a real demand there. And again, the national security community can take advantage of innovations there. The other place, and I testified on this when I gave my July 22nd testimony before Senate Commerce, we're now starting to see companies. Tim Fernholz of Quartz had a quote called "All companies are space companies now." And what we're really starting to see is companies that really have had nothing to do with space ever are now saying, gee, space is accessible enough, and I don't have to worry about TT&C, and I don't have to worry about launch and things like that, that they're starting to make experimental bets on space activities. And the early trio we see companies experimenting with, not unexpectedly, are remote sensing, IoT, and high-speed communications. And that's sort of the initial trio people are working with. And the extent to which we're going to see innovations coming out of those places for completely different reasons, the national security community should be able to benefit from that. So I think we'll see another whole wave of innovation as more and more people start to leverage this increasingly accessible amount of space capability.
All right, so final round of questions before we come to the end of the hour. I think all of us have been around in the space community long enough to see boom and bust cycles. And I was out in the industry during the early 2000s when the bubble burst and all these grand plans for large constellations and things like that just suddenly came crashing down. To each of you, do you think we're in a bubble right now that's going to pop, or do you think the boom will continue, or something in between? So, Derek, why don't I start with you?
I think we've actually gotten to the point where we have sustainable growth. I don't think we're in a bubble, and the reason being is the cost per launch has gone down, and it's not just that there's a pretty robust launch industry that is driving that price down, and I actually think that over the next 3 to 5 years, that price is even going to be driven down further as we get more new launch entrants that come on board and start to enable access to space. So realistically, that has always been the bane of space, as access, and as that price has been extremely high, you've had to get into this spiral where you had to invest a lot to make sure your satellites would last a long time and make them extremely expensive, and then that would just feed off itself. Whereas now, with the price of launch that's gone down, we can really get into spiral development and push satellites up and get new capabilities, and people can actually use space to experiment with new business models and new technologies rather than make sure that they're 100% right out the gate. So I don't think we're in a bubble. I think this is solid growth.
Sue, what do you think?
Somewhere in between. I agree with Derek, but I think two things have to happen. Number one is much more drive from the use case side in terms of the things you want to do with it, so you can improve usability, right? So I worry that this is going to be another open source where you have so much information being produced, but it's not being produced as usably as it would need. And so I think it is the advance in use cases and usability that will drive. And I just will resonate with things that Kevin said. This responsible use of space really needs to be addressed. You can't have everyone playing this massive game of commons as though I'm going to be able to operate without being responsible for what we all need in order to be able to do it. So those two things, if we'll address those simultaneously, I totally think this is a sustainable growth. But I think those two will determine the extent of the impact of that growth.
And Kevin, you get the last word.
Thanks. And so again, I'm also a believer in that we're in rapidly sustainable growth, if you will. But what that doesn't mean is that everybody will succeed in the market. I mean, in many ways, this is becoming a normal market. And sometimes people say, shucks, Kevin, we thought we were special. And you are all special. We love you all, but it's becoming a normal market in that if someone fails, there is enough breadth and depth and backing in the market that they will be absorbed in a normal market way. There'll be M&A activities. There will be, again, in the early days of commercial remote sensing, we used to say, well, gee, if the government invests in this company and it fails, we've got on-orbit assets to worry about. We have archival obligations to worry about, et cetera. What if the Chinese come in? All of those kinds of things. This is a much broader market right now with different kind of backing, and you'll continue to see normal market behavior for companies that don't succeed. I mean, we're seeing some of this in the SPACed companies already, although it has nothing to do with other companies failing. They're just starting to build up their capabilities, diversify their capabilities because they have the resources available. So I wouldn't throw it into boom or bust language, but I would just say this is becoming much more of a normal market, and that's actually a good thing.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. This has been a really great, insightful discussion. I want to have you all back soon to continue the discussion, but thank you so much. And thank you for everyone in the audience for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks
for having us. Take care, everybody.